At 2:47 a.m. on March 15, 2003, my mother's heart monitor flatlined. But when I touched her chest, I could feel something was terribly wrong. The incision wasn't from her surgery 3 days earlier. It was fresh, still bleeding, and it ran from her sternum to her navel. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Chen, avoided my eyes when I asked why my mother's abdomen was hollow to the touch. If this story disturbs you as much as it should, please hit that like button and subscribe. What happened to my mother could happen to anyone's family member in any hospital, anywhere. My mother, Patricia Reynolds, was 67 when she went into Mercy General Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio, for what should have been a straightforward gallbladder removal. She'd been experiencing pain for months, and her primary care physician, Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, had recommended the laparoscopic procedure as minimally invasive with a quick recovery time. I remember the exact moment we walked through those automatic glass doors on March 12 at 6:15 a.m. Mom squeezed my hand and said, "Danny, I'll see you when I wake up." She was nervous but optimistic. The pre-operative nurse, Janet Morrison, had 23 years of experience and reassured us that Dr. Chen had performed over 400 similar procedures. The surgery was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. and expected to last 90 minutes. At 10:45 a.m., Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room, still in his scrubs, and told me everything had gone perfectly. His exact words were, "Your mother did beautifully. The gallbladder came out clean, no complications. She'll be groggy for a few hours, but she should be home by Friday." But something in his demeanor felt off. He wouldn't maintain eye contact, kept checking his watch, and his hands had an almost imperceptible tremor. When I asked to see her, he said she needed a bit more time in recovery, and suggested I grab lunch in the cafeteria. At 2:17 p.m., I was finally allowed into the recovery room. Mom was conscious but disoriented, which the nurses assured me was normal post-anesthesia confusion. She kept touching her abdomen and wincing, saying it felt wrong inside. When I mentioned this to the recovery nurse, Linda Santos, she increased the morphine drip and said, "Surgery always feels strange at first." That evening, Mom seemed stable. Her vital signs were good, and she was able to sip some broth. Dr. Chen made his rounds at 7:30 p.m., spent maybe 90 seconds checking her chart, and said she was progressing nicely. But I noticed he didn't examine her incision sites, which seemed unusual for a surgeon checking his own work. The night shift brought different nurses, and I stayed in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her bed. At 11:43 p.m., Mom woke up confused and agitated, pulling at her 4 lines. The night nurse, Carol Martinez, administered a sedative and told me this was not uncommon after abdominal surgery. What I didn't know was that at 1:15 a.m., while I dozed fitfully in that chair, a team I'd never seen before wheeled my mother out of her room. The chart later showed this as a routine transfer for additional monitoring, but no one had informed me, and when I woke at 2:30 a.m., her bed was empty. I found her in a different wing of the hospital, in what the staff called the Specialized Recovery Unit. The room was dimmer, with different equipment I didn't recognize. When I asked why she'd been moved, the night supervisor, Margaret Foster, gave me a vague explanation about better monitoring capabilities, and assured me it was standard protocol for patients showing post-operative confusion. But my mother wasn't confused anymore. She was unconscious, and her breathing seemed labored despite the oxygen mask. The monitors showed irregular patterns that meant nothing to me but seemed to concern the technician who kept adjusting settings and making notes. At 2:47 a.m., the alarms started screaming. The crash team arrived within seconds, Dr. Chen leading, followed by 2 residents I'd seen earlier, Dr. Sarah Kim and Dr. Michael Torres. They worked on my mother for 37 minutes. I watched from the corner of the room as they pumped her chest, injected medications, and shouted medical terms I didn't understand. At 3:24 a.m., Dr. Chen stepped back from the bed, pulled off his gloves, and said the words that shattered my world, "I'm sorry. We've done everything we could." But as I approached her bed to say goodbye, Something felt wrong. My mother's hospital gown had shifted during the resuscitation, and I could see surgical tape along her abdomen that hadn't been there before. When I gently touched the area over her stomach, expecting the firmness of post-surgical swelling, I felt nothing. It was like touching an empty bag. "Doctor," I said, my voice barely steady, "why does my mother's abdomen feel hollow?" Dr. Chen's face went pale. He quickly pulled the gown back into place and said, "Sometimes after surgery and the resuscitation efforts, the tissue can feel different. It's normal." But I knew it wasn't normal. I'd held my mother hundreds of times throughout my life. I knew how her body felt. This wasn't right. I demanded to see her chart. Dr. Chen hesitated, then said the chart was being updated and would be available later. When I insisted on speaking to the hospital administrator, he told me that wouldn't be possible until regular business hours. At 4:15 a.m., a hospital security guard, Thomas Mitchell, approached me and suggested I might be more comfortable waiting in the family consultation room. It wasn't really a suggestion. When I refused to leave my mother's side, he mentioned that the medical examiner would need to prepare the body, and that family members weren't typically present for that process. That's when I realized they were trying to get me away from her. I called my lawyer, Robert Steinberg, at 4:33 a.m. He was groggy but alert when I explained the situation. His exact words were, "Don't let them take her body anywhere. Don't sign anything. I'll be there in an hour." But an hour felt like a lifetime when I was sitting beside my mother's body, feeling that horrible emptiness where her organs should have been. I kept thinking about the fresh surgical tape, about Dr. Chen's nervous behavior, about that mysterious transfer to the specialized recovery unit. At 5:20 a.m., a woman in a business suit introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh, patient advocate. She had a clipboard full of forms and spoke in soothing tones about making arrangements and easing the family's burden during this difficult time. When she asked me to sign a release form for the body, I told her I was waiting for my lawyer. Her demeanor changed immediately. She left the room and returned 5 minutes later with 2 additional security guards. At 5:47 a.m., my lawyer arrived. Robert Steinberg had been practicing medical malpractice law for 18 years, and he took one look at the situation and demanded to examine my mother's body immediately. The hospital staff tried to refuse, but he threatened to call the police and obtain an emergency court order. What we discovered changed everything. When we carefully lifted my mother's hospital gown, we found not 1 but 3 separate incision sites. The original laparoscopic ports from the gallbladder surgery were there, as expected. But there was also a 12-inch midline incision from her sternum to just below her navel, closed with fresh sutures that were clearly made hours after the original surgery. Robert took photographs with his phone while I held my mother's hand and tried not to be sick. When we gently pressed along her abdomen, it was obvious that something major was missing. Her liver, kidneys, heart, gone. The cavity that should have contained her vital organs felt like a deflated balloon. At 6:23 a.m., Dr. Chen returned to the room with Hospital Administrator Helen Morrison and their legal counsel, David Richardson. They found us documenting the evidence of what had been done to my mother. The silence in that room was deafening. "Mr. Reynolds," Hospital Administrator Helen Morrison began, her voice carefully controlled, "I understand your grieving, but there are proper procedures for handling concerns about medical care." My lawyer, Robert Steinberg, didn't let her finish. "This isn't a concern about medical care. This is evidence of major surgical procedures performed without consent on a dying patient. We need explanations, and we need them now." Dr. Chen stood behind Morrison, his face ashen. When Robert demanded to know why my mother had undergone organ removal surgery, Chen's response was barely audible. There may have been complications that required additional intervention. What complications require removing a patient's heart, liver, and kidneys? Robert pressed. The legal counsel, David Richardson, stepped forward. These are serious allegations that require proper investigation through appropriate channels. The family needs time to process their grief before making hasty accusations. But Robert wasn't backing down. At 7:15 a.m., he called the county medical examiner's office and requested an immediate autopsy hold on my mother's body. By 7:45 a.m., medical examiner Dr. Patricia Lawson had arrived at the hospital and was examining my mother. Dr. Lawson had 31 years of experience and had seen everything. But when she completed her preliminary examination, her expression was grim. She pulled Robert and me aside and confirmed what we already knew. Multiple organs have been surgically removed post-mortem or during the final hours of life. This requires a full forensic investigation. The hospital's response was swift and coordinated. By 9:30 a.m., they had produced a revised surgical report claiming that my mother had suffered catastrophic organ failure during the night and that emergency surgical intervention had been attempted to save her life. The report was signed by Dr. Chen and countersigned by Dr. Kim and Dr. Torres. But there were problems with their story. The timestamps didn't match the nursing notes. The medications listed weren't reflected in the pharmacy records. Most damning of all, the emergency surgical intervention they described would have required a full surgical team, yet there was no record of the operating room being used between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. At 11:20 a.m., I received a call from my insurance company. Someone from the hospital had contacted them to verify coverage for emergency multi-organ transplant procedures. When I told them no such procedures had been authorized, the insurance representative, Mary Chen, no relation to the doctor, became confused. According to her records, organs from a Patricia Reynolds had been matched with 3 different recipients at transplant centers across Ohio. My mother had never been an organ donor. I had her driver's license in my wallet, and there was no donor designation. When Robert contacted the organ procurement organization that had supposedly coordinated the transplants, they claimed to have received proper authorization from the family. No one had ever spoken to me about organ donation. By 2 p.m., we had discovered that my mother's liver had been transplanted into a 34-year-old father of 2 in Columbus. Her kidneys had gone to a dialysis patient in Cincinnati. Her heart had been given to a teenager in Toledo who had been on the waiting list for 8 months. All of these transplants had been performed in the early morning hours of March 15th, using organs that had been harvested from my mother while she was still alive. At 3:30 p.m., Dr. Chen was called into a meeting with hospital administration. At 4:45 p.m., the hospital's public relations director, Sandra Phillips, issued a statement calling the situation a tragic misunderstanding and announcing that Dr. Chen had requested a transfer to pursue research opportunities at another facility. By 5 p.m. that same day, Dr. Chen had cleared out his office and left Mercy General Hospital. By the following Monday, he had started a new position at University Hospital in Detroit, Michigan, where he continued performing surgery as if nothing had happened. The hospital offered me a settlement conference for the following week. The settlement conference took place in a windowless conference room on the hospital's administrative floor. Present were Helen Morrison, legal counsel David Richardson, Dr. Patricia Lawson from the medical examiner's office, my lawyer Robert Steinberg, and myself. Morrison began with what she called a comprehensive explanation of events. According to her version, my mother had suffered unexpected complications after her gallbladder surgery. At approximately 1 a.m., she had gone into multi-organ failure, and Dr. Chen had made the decision to attempt heroic measures to save her life. Unfortunately, Morrison continued, Mrs. Reynolds had suffered irreversible brain death by the time we realized the extent of her organ failure. At that point, the family had previously indicated interest in organ donation. This was a complete lie. I had never indicated any such thing. When I challenged this claim, Richardson produced a form with my signature, supposedly signed at 1:45 a.m. on March 15th. The signature looked authentic, but I had been asleep in the chair next to my mother's bed at that time. I had never seen this form before, and I certainly had never signed it. Robert examined the form and immediately spotted irregularities. The timestamp was inconsistent with the hospital's own security logs, which showed I had never left the building. The form was dated March 15th, but the paper stock was different from other hospital forms from that period. Most suspiciously, the witness signature belonged to Nurse Carol Martinez, who had left her shift at midnight. Dr. Lawson presented her preliminary autopsy findings. My mother's organs had been removed with surgical precision, using techniques consistent with organ procurement procedures. However, tissue samples showed that the organs were still viable at the time of removal, indicating they had been harvested while my mother's heart was still beating. This suggests, Dr. Lawson stated carefully, that the organ procurement occurred either immediately before or coincident with cardiac death. Richardson immediately objected to this characterization. The timing of organ procurement in transplant medicine is complex and often requires technical decisions that lay people might misinterpret. But Robert had done his homework. He had consulted with Dr. Amanda Foster, a transplant coordinator with 15 years of experience, who confirmed that the procedures described in my mother's case violated every established protocol for organ donation. Organs cannot be legally harvested until brain death has been declared by 2 independent physicians, and the family must provide explicit consent with multiple witnesses. None of these protocols had been followed. At 2:15 p.m., Richardson made the hospital's offer, a settlement of $750,000 in exchange for my agreement not to pursue further legal action and to maintain confidentiality about the case. The money would be paid from the hospital's malpractice insurance, and there would be no admission of wrongdoing. I asked what would happen to Dr. Chen and the other staff members involved. Morrison's response was clinical. Personnel matters are handled internally according to our established procedures. Dr. Chen's transfer was unrelated to this incident and had been planned for several months. This was another lie. Robert had contacted Dr. Chen's previous positions and confirmed that his transfer to Detroit had been arranged in less than 48 hours, with the receiving hospital conducting no background check or credential verification. At 3:30 p.m., I declined the settlement offer. Richardson's demeanor changed immediately. "Mr. Reynolds, I should warn you that pursuing litigation in a case like this can be very expensive and emotionally traumatic. These cases often drag on for years, and the outcomes are unpredictable." What he didn't say, but what was clearly implied, was that the hospital had resources to fight this for as long as necessary, while I was a grieving son with limited means. Robert requested copies of all medical records, security footage, and staff schedules from March 12th to 15th. Richardson agreed to provide relevant documentation, but warned that some materials might be privileged or protected by patient privacy laws. When we received the materials 2 weeks later, they had been heavily redacted. The security footage from the Specialized Recovery Unit was mysteriously corrupted. Dr. Chen's surgical notes for the morning of March 15th were missing entirely. By April 1st, we had learned that Dr. Chen's medical license had never been suspended or flagged in any way. His transfer to Detroit had been processed as a routine personnel move, with no mention of the circumstances surrounding his departure from Cleveland. The 3 patients who had received my mother's organs were all recovering well. Their families had no idea that the organs had been obtained through unauthorized procurement from a patient who may have still been alive. On April 15th, the Ohio State Medical Board informed us that they were reviewing the matter, but that such reviews typically took 6 to 18 months to complete. By May 1st, it became clear that no one was going to be held accountable for what had been done to my mother. 6 months after my mother's death, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to track Dr. Chen's career progression. What we discovered revealed a pattern that went far beyond a single incident at Mercy General Hospital. Dr. Chen had started his surgical residency at Johns Hopkins in 1989. In 1994, he had been quietly transferred to Cleveland Clinic after what hospital records described as procedural concerns during organ procurement protocols. The specifics were sealed, but Webb found 3 families in Baltimore who had raised questions about unauthorized organ harvesting involving their deceased relatives. In 1998, Dr. Chen had moved from Cleveland Clinic to Mercy General following what his personnel file called philosophical differences regarding transplant medicine ethics. During his 5 years at Mercy General before my mother's death, there had been at least 7 instances of families questioning post-mortem surgical procedures that weren't clearly explained in medical records. Now, at University Hospital in Detroit, Dr. Chen was thriving. He had been promoted to Chief of Transplant Surgery within 8 months of his arrival. His patient reviews were excellent, and his surgical outcomes were statistically superior to national averages. But Webb had identified 12 families in the Detroit area who had experienced similar situations to mine. Loved ones who had died after routine surgeries, whose bodies showed evidence of organ removal that hadn't been authorized or clearly explained. The pattern was consistent across all cases: elderly patients undergoing non-critical procedures, unexpected complications leading to death, and organs that somehow found their way into the transplant system despite the lack of proper donor authorization. In November 2003, I contacted investigative journalist Sarah Martinez from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Sarah had won awards for her coverage of medical malpractice cases and was interested in pursuing the story. But after 3 weeks of initial research, she called to tell me that her editor had killed the piece. "Too many powerful interests," she explained quietly. "The hospital, the transplant organizations, the medical board, they all have reasons to keep this quiet. I'm sorry, Danny, but I can't help you." By December 2003, my lawsuit against Mercy General had been quietly settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The terms included a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from discussing the case publicly or cooperating with any media investigations. Robert Steinberg had advised me that continuing to fight would likely bankrupt me without achieving justice. The hospital had unlimited legal resources, and the medical establishment would protect its own. Taking the settlement was the only practical option, even though it meant Dr. Chen and the others would never face consequences for what they had done. On January 15, 2004, exactly 10 months after my mother's death, I received a call from Marcus Webb. Dr. Chen had been promoted again, this time to director of the University Hospital Transplant Institute. The promotion came with a $200,000 salary increase and a 5-year contract. That same week, I learned that the teenager in Toledo who had received my mother's heart had died from complications related to organ rejection. His family had no idea that the heart had been obtained through unauthorized procurement. As I write this, Dr. Chen continues to practice transplant surgery in Detroit. His reputation in the medical community is exemplary. He has published research papers on improving organ procurement procedures and has been invited to speak at national conferences on transplant ethics. The Ohio State Medical Board closed its investigation in March 2005, citing insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. Mercy General Hospital implemented new protocols for organ donation procedures, but the specific changes were never made public. The families of the patients who received my mother's organs were never told the true circumstances of how those organs were obtained. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in the hospital's legal department, there are records of at least 6 other cases similar to mine, all settled quietly, all covered by non-disclosure agreements, all forgotten by everyone except the families who lost their loved ones. My mother died believing she was going to recover from a simple gallbladder surgery. Instead, she became an unwilling organ donor in a system that values transplantable tissue more than informed consent, more than ethics, more than the trust patients place in their doctors. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. Dr. Chen was transferred quietly. The hospital avoided liability, the transplant recipients got their organs, and the truth was buried under layers of legal protection and institutional silence. 15 years later, I still think about my mother every day. Not just about how she died, but about how the system failed her so completely. Patricia Reynolds was a retired schoolteacher who had spent 43 years helping children learn to read. She believed in institutions, in following rules, in trusting authority figures to do the right thing. She would have been horrified to know that her death became part of a system that prioritizes outcomes over ethics, that protects doctors who violate their most sacred trust, that treats patients' bodies as resources to be harvested rather than people to be healed. But what haunts me most is the knowledge that this is still happening. Dr. Chen is still practicing, still performing transplant surgeries, still being protected by a system that values his surgical skills more than his ethical violations. And somewhere tonight, another family is sitting in a hospital waiting room, trusting that their loved one is receiving the best possible care, unaware that their trust might be misplaced. The settlement I received can never compensate for what was taken from my mother, from me, from our family. But it did allow me to create the Patricia Reynolds Foundation, which advocates for transparency in organ procurement procedures and supports families who have experienced similar violations. If you're reading this, if you've made it this far, then you understand that this isn't just about one corrupt doctor or one negligent hospital. This is about a system that protects itself at the expense of the patients it claims to serve. The next time you or someone you love enters a hospital for what should be a routine procedure, remember Patricia Reynolds. Ask questions. Demand explanations. Don't let them transfer your loved one without your knowledge. Don't sign any forms you haven't read completely. And never, ever assume that wearing a white coat makes someone trustworthy. Because sometimes, the people we trust most to preserve life are the same people who profit from death. If this story has affected you, please share it. Comment below if you've experienced something similar, or if you know someone who has. Subscribe to help us tell these stories that the medical establishment doesn't want you to hear. Justice for Patricia Reynolds may have been denied, but awareness can prevent future tragedies.